Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions webinar on how policymakers can protect free and fair elections, which is related to their Defending Democracy report that they put out very recently that you should look at. The reason that we're here today is to talk about the potential effects of threats, armed intimidation, and political violence in general on our elections. Our recent elections have been marked, obviously, by the violence of January 6, 2021, but we are also seeing sort of less prominently, we've seen armed protests at state capitals. We've seen bomb threats being directed towards secretaries of state and individual state capitals. And we've seen elected officials and election officials being threatened in increasingly prevalent numbers. So what we want to do today is take advantage of some expert panelists that we're all very lucky to be able to speak with to discuss the implications of these threats to our politics, and to what the public understands as the threats and steps our leaders could take to protect our democratic institutions. I'm going to introduce the panelists that we're going to speak with today. I'm going to start with Dr. Rudabeh Kishi, who is the Chief Research Officer at the Bridging Divides Initiative, which is a nonpartisan research initiative at Princeton University that tracks and mitigates political violence in the U.S. Next, we have Tim Carey, who is a law and policy advisor at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Housed within the School of Public Health, the center develops and applies scientific research to identify and advocate for a range of innovative gun violence solutions. And third, we have Jen Dresden, who is a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit working to prevent the United States from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. And Jen and I have been working recently on a project that she is going to talk to you a little bit about coming up next. We're going to turn to Jen to hear what the research says about the scope of this problem of threats and violence in our elections. Go ahead, Jen.
Thanks, Lily. And thanks very much to the Center for organizing this event. This is a tremendously important conversation, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be part of today's session. So as Lily noted, my job, at least as it's been described to me, is to offer some context about what the landscape of political violence looks like in the United States and the effects that it's having on our democracy. I'd like to begin by offering some broad context and then dive into a little bit of the data that Lily mentioned that's from the last few months and that hopefully helps to shed some light on the question. So how is political violence affecting US democracy? Well, the good news is that when it comes to political violence specifically, acts of physical aggression remain relatively rare in the United States. Political violence does occur, and it does appear that levels are higher than they have been in decades. And of course, any amount of political violence is too much for a healthy democracy. But for many Americans, this isn't something they're going to be encountering on a daily basis. And so it might be tempting to look at the numbers right now and say, oh, well, maybe we should prioritize something else. But there are two things that really complicate that perspective. And the first is that in the ecosystem of political violence, as Lily mentioned, physical harm isn't the whole story. Much of what we see today takes the form of violent threats and intimidation, and those are much more common than many of us realize. And while these are certainly different from physical harm like assault, perhaps, if we're looking at the health of our democracy, they can still be very damaging. And that's the second thing that I really want to ground us in today, which is this idea that incidence, the amount of violence, is not the same thing as impact. So political violence by its very nature has effects that are greater than the very real and often tragic effects on particular individuals. A few instances can have systemic effects and really impact the way our system works. Or in other circumstances, our institutions might be really strong and resilient enough to function fairly normally, even in the face of repeated threats. So if we want to answer this question of how political violence is affecting US democracy, we need a lot of different kinds of data. both because we need ways to track the different types of political violence and aggression, but also because we need some way to assess how much harm is actually being done. And so the data that I'm sharing today comes from the Violence and Democracy Impact Tracker, or VDIT, which, as Lily mentioned, is a tool that we at Protect Democracy have developed in partnership with Lily and the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. To give you a little bit of background on the tracker, every quarter, VDIT reaches out to hundreds of researchers on political violence, both here in the US and overseas, and solicits their views on how much political violence is impacting the overall health of democracy in the US, as well as 8 pillars of democratic practice, ranging from vote access to freedoms of speech and assembly, to the ability of the legislature and judiciary to check the executive. And you can see those 8 pillars listed here on the slide. The tracker asks respondents to rate the impact of political violence on a scale of 1 to 5. And here you see the averages for the fourth quarter of 2023. To give you a little bit of a sense of the scale, a rating of 1 indicates that the impact is within the range of a normal, healthy democracy, and 5 indicates an impact that is so severe that it amounts to democratic breakdown. We recently fielded the third wave of this survey, and those results will be published in a couple of weeks. So do stay tuned and sign up for updates on our website, protectdemocracy.org. But the numbers I'm presenting today are from the survey that went into the field in October. But I will note that the most recent results are mostly consistent with the numbers I'm going to show here today. So what do experts say about how much damage political violence is doing to our democracy? Well, on average, overall, the experts said that the impact was a level 2.56 out of 5. So to translate that into words as opposed to just numbers, most experts viewed political violence as having an impact on our democracy that is abnormal for a well-functioning democracy. So what we are seeing today is certainly not normal. But while many of those experts who viewed this as abnormal saw it as not necessarily destabilizing, as abnormal, but things largely functioning normally, just over half of the folks who responded to our survey expressed the view that the current impact of political violence in the US does raise the risk of democratic breakdown in the future. And as I noted before, and you saw on the prior slide, VDIT also asks experts about their assessment of political violence's impact across different pillars of democratic practice, using the same 5-point scale. And consistent across the first 2 editions of the tracker, and as a preview, it's consistent in the third wave as well, and that data will be coming out in a few weeks. Among those 8 pillars, experts expressed the highest level of concern about the electoral process as the part of our democracy that's being most impacted by political violence. So in the fourth quarter of last year, 53% of respondents reported that political violence had an impact equivalent to significant erosion of democratic quality and raising the risk of breakdown in our electoral processes in the future. I do want to pause here and emphasize that these responses reflect forward-looking assessments and concerns. I'm no fan of chicken littling data like this. So I do see this as an indication that experts are concerned and that we should be motivated to be proactive now in protecting free and fair elections going forward. In addition to our quantitative findings, VDIT also asks experts to name the aspect of political violence that most concerns them right now in the United States. It's an open-ended question, so they can name anything. And what we have here are the top 5 concerns referenced in those responses in that last wave of the survey at the end of 2023. And you can see what the top 5 responses were here. But I want to highlight among them that violence directed at the electoral process was one of the top 5 most frequently cited concerns. And this wasn't just in this particular wave of the survey. Violence directed at the electoral process has made those top 5 concerns in each of the waves of the VDIT tracker that we have put into the field so far. And I want to highlight that because what we're seeing here is that concerns about violence in the electoral process is turning up as the highest concern, both in the quantitative and the qualitative data that we've been seeing. So this is a consistent concern. And as a final note, VDIT provides its respondents with a definition of political violence that includes violent threats and intimidation, as well as physical harm. But we also ask them how much they're thinking about these different aspects of violence when they're evaluating the impact as they report their answers. One thing that I really want to highlight here is that it's very striking that the extent to which experts are considering the impact of threats and intimidation is quite high when they're thinking about impact. So it's not just physical harm that's on their radar. And I want to offer these results to sort of reinforce what Lily noted in her introductory remarks, which is that it's this whole sort of panoply of behavior and things that we're seeing that are having an impact and that we should be paying attention to as we're trying to assess this question of how political violence is impacting our democracy. So with that, I think I'm at my time, and I'll throw things back to Lily.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. One thing that I want to note here is that there is a Q&A function in this Zoom meeting, so please feel free to ask questions in there either during these presentations or after we are finished with our main statements from each speaker. We will have a Q&A session after all of the speakers have finished discussing their most recent work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rudabeh Kishi. She is going to present some data from the Bridging Divides Initiative, talking about threats to elections and local elected officials.
Thanks, Lily. And just to echo Jen, this is such an important conversation. So thanks for joining us today. As they mentioned at the beginning, at BDI, we track and mitigate political violence in the US. And so much of our work really revolves around getting the right information into the right hands at the right time. And so that way individuals, organizations, and leaders can all act together to tackle political violence. And so I oversee BDI's work around delivering action-oriented research. So I'm excited to share a little bit more about one of our research projects in particular, understanding threats and harassment to local officials, but wanted to share this quick snapshot of the wider work that we do at BDI in hopes that you'll know that we have a range of nonpartisan research and resources that you might find useful. So you can go to the next slide, Joe. This Understanding Threats project draws on mixed methods approaches, including in-depth interviews, representative surveys, and event data collection. And together, these really help us to understand the risk to local officials. So here you can see a snapshot of the report we published last year on the qualitative data that we'd collected on threats and harassment to local elected officials via interviews. I think a link to the report is hopefully being dropped in the chat. And so we're planning to publish a new one later this year, now that we've conducted over 100 interviews with various local officials. But on the next slide, these are findings from the survey component of that work. These are carried out by our partners at Civic Pulse. And they reach out quarterly to local elected officials to collect information firsthand. And so you can see here, based on 6 rounds of surveys to date, that over the last 16 months, experiences of threats and harassment have remained widespread, and importantly, they cut across party lines. So more than half of the surveyed elected officials reported being insulted, that's in pink. Over a third reported being harassed, that's in purple. And nearly 1 in 6 reported threats, that's in brown, in any given 3-month window of time. And this is particularly important to be tracking because local officials who have experienced hostility report a decreased willingness to participate in political processes. These are things like seeking re-election or attending public events. And so really this means that unfortunately, this type of hostility is working, right? It's curbing the activities of officials. And these findings are based on the latest trends that we've seen in the data that we published earlier this month. And there's a link to the press release in the chat. On the next slide, you can see that while these trends are concerning in and of themselves, but they're even more concerning is how women and minority officials are actually disproportionately likely to experience insults, harassment, threats relative to their peers. And this is true even after we control for other factors like party, constituency size, etc. And if you want to download and work with the survey data yourself, there's a link to how to request the raw data in the chat. On the next slide, in addition to the survey data and interviews, we also collect quantitative event-based data, and this is via our Threats and Harassment Data Set, or THD. So for this data collection work, we have a team of research assistants that gather and code information on threats and harassment of of local elected, appointed, and municipal officials across the country. And this is largely via secondary sources, but we do have plans to begin integrating primary information in the future too. And so in the data set, we capture a wide variety of variables, indicators, information like the type of official, whether they're election officials, school officials, health officials, et cetera, any affiliations of perpetrators, the nature and method of the threat or harassment, like how it was delivered, the issues that drive this type of targeting, and more. And this is all in addition to information about the date, place, et cetera, around incidents so that trends can really be monitored and mapped and tracked over time. So we're planning to formally launch the data set publicly next month, and that'll be updated monthly thereafter with all the latest information. So if you're interested in updates on that release, there will be a link in the chat for how to sign up for updates, et cetera, so you'll know when that's out. And so while we're still working on finalizing things for the release, I did want to share some preliminary data trends with you all just to give you a taste. On the next page, to begin with, you can see a map of all local elected, appointed, or municipal officials. And this is all the threats and harassment that they've experienced by state. So you can see that risks to local officials are quite pervasive. And given the nature of the THG data collection, the information is collected on a broad range of types of local officials. So the data also allow for comparisons across different types of officials. So for example, we can compare election officials and poll workers. That might be a subset that's, of particular interest given the topic of conversation today, relative to other types of local officials. And that way we can better understand what unique risks they might be facing. So for example, on the next slide, you can see that local officials can be targeted with threats and harassment by perpetrators in various ways, both where the perpetrator might be physically present when targeting. So this can be like someone verbally yelling at someone or demonstrating at their personal home, or when perpetrators might be physically removed from them. So this is when targeting could be virtual, let's say, like carried out by a phone call or online. And so diving into the data a bit more deeply, when comparing election officials and poll workers, that's the bar on the left, to all other local officials on the right, you can see that the data suggests that election officials are disproportionately targeted by perpetrators who use non-electronic media to target them. That's in orange, over a fifth of the time. And so this includes things like targeting an official with a physical letter that might contain photos, let's say, or a postcard or a gift, quote unquote, left at like an official's home or office. And some have reported that such targeting can be particularly jarring as it's more tangible in nature, even though the perpetrator might not be physically present. Similarly jarring on the next slide can be the fact that election officials or poll workers, again on the left, are the targets of stalking or being followed, and that's in red, slightly more often than their counterparts. And on the next slide, you can see that the severity of threats or harassment that local officials face can also vary when comparing election officials and poll workers, again on the left, to all other types of local officials on the right. The data suggests that election officials are disproportionately targeted via death threats and threats of physical harm or violence. That's in green relative to their counterparts. So these trends are even more concerning when we consider them alongside those on the last slides, because together they really suggest a real severe erosion of both real and perceived safety of election officials. So overall, I think these trends are, really just a few types of questions that can be answered by the new THG data, but they really help to demonstrate how election officials in particular can face very unique risks. And as the 2024 presidential election nears, where tensions will be undoubtedly really high, in particular around election officials and poll workers, really being able to address concerns will be even more pressing. And so understanding behavior, being able to do regular monitoring and tracking of this type of activity will really hopefully help better equip decision makers, community leaders, and the broader public to be able to really create space for de-escalation, healing, safety, especially reducing the space for threats and harassment, since that's such a critical step for protecting democratic norms and institutions. And thank you. We have the BDI email on the next page in the event anyone has any particular questions about the data that might arise after today's presentation. Thanks. I'll hand it back over to you, Lily.
Thank you, Rutabaga. Those data are so interesting, so important. And I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in from the audience for you. So we'll get into those during the Q&A. I'm happy to introduce our third speaker, Tim Carey, who is actually who is the law and policy advisor at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, the people that are hosting this. And he is going to talk to us about potential solutions that they identified in their Defending Democracy report. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you so much, Lily, and so much thanks to you and Jen and for Rutabaga for coming and sharing your unique perspectives and expertise on this issue. Because especially as we get closer and closer to 2024 elections, it's becoming so much more imminent in people's minds, the potential risks that are being faced by both our democracy, but also the people that serve it, to violence, to threats, to other forms of disruption. So I also thank you for laying the scene so effectively in terms of what we've heard so far about violence, and the threats of violence, and the profound impact they have on our democracy and the people who are serving it. Violence and intimidation, as you've heard, can take many forms, but one way we see it acutely reveal itself in the United States is through the presence of not just digital media, physical media, stalking, these other issues that we've heard, but also through firearms. And the growing presence of firearms in political spaces in the United States endangers public health, safety, and the functioning of democracy. And additional to the general threats of public safety posed by the public carry of firearms, which can include in states with laxer public carry laws, we've seen increased rates of lost and stolen firearms, increased rates of violent crime, and higher rates of death by firearm. But separate from those, there are several high-profile incidents over the past few years highlighting the mix of guns and public and politics specifically. For example, when you look at the armed takeovers of the Idaho, Michigan, and Oregon state capitals during COVID measures in 2020, the armed protests outside Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan vote counting centers after the presidential elections in 2020, the armed poll watchers patrolling draw boxes in Arizona during the 2020 midterm elections, and so much more. But we at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions and other situated organizations are looking to see how we can take proactive steps to create solutions that can help mitigate the risks of violence that we're seeing play out in the world around us. And in the Defending Democracy report that we published last year, there were 6 key recommendations, 5 of which that are policy-based, that we've recommended in order to help mitigate some of these threats. And the first, you could probably guess from my preamble, is regulating the public carry of firearms, given that the open display of firearms, in addition to being inherently threatening and dangerous, can also chill the exercise of other rights, most notably the rights to speech, the rights to have your votes heard and counted in democratic elections. It intersects with people's ability to feel like they can go out and openly exercise these other aspects of their civil rights and liberties. Looking at research from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, we've seen that the presence of firearms in public demonstrations can increase the likelihood of violence by 6.5 times that of similar events where firearms are not evident. And that itself is a helpful cue in that this policy could help mitigate the risks that we're seeing today. Likewise, we encourage the strengthening of existing laws or the increasement of enforcement of current laws that prohibit paramilitary activity. And by paramilitary activity, referring to military-style groups that are privately organized and thus unaccountable to the will of the people. Most states have laws addressing, to some extent, military-style militia-esque activity, but many are very old and archaic and in some ways difficult to apply in the modern day. Especially given we've seen the involvement of several of these pseudo-style militia groups in January 6th and other high-profile protests and clashes between civil rights and displays of arms. It's imperative that we enforce or rehash some of these laws that may be already on the books or retool them to the modern day to help ensure that the presence of firearms itself and those wielding them does not give an unweighted currency to those ideals that stoke violence instead of collective political growth and progress. Third, we focus on prohibiting the civilian possession of firearms in locations essential to political participation, such as polling places, legislative buildings, and protests to protect the four core functions of government. And as, for example, as violent as the insurrection on January 6th was, there was little to no gun violence on that day, in large part because the District of Columbia has very strong laws regulating who can carry firearms and in what places. Even members of the Oath Keepers who testified in court during hearings attached to the January 6th convictions admitted that they stored caches of guns in Virginia on January 6th because of DC's strong laws. That shows, and that's just one illustration of how this preventative effect can help mitigate risks of violence, where some of these places where we've seen more of an influx of guns in places where voters gather, where legislators gather, don't have similar protections. Even the Supreme Court, in its recent opinion in 2022 about gun cases, Nizerpa v. Bruin, held that, or at least said in its opinion, that legislative buildings and polling places specifically are locations where firearms could be constitutionally limited, which gives promising credence to the viability of those laws. Fourth, we recommend the enactment and implementation of extreme risk protection order laws to temporarily disarm people who pose a high risk of violence. These laws are sometimes referred to as red flag laws or ERPOs in an abbreviated form, but extreme risk protection orders are court orders used to temporarily prohibit the possession and purchase of firearms by persons deemed by a court to pose a significant risk of danger to causing injury to themselves or others with firearms. And though ERPOs are often used to prevent suicide, and we have a wealth of data supporting that, there's also promising data about ERPOs as tools to prevent mass shootings. And we've seen several case studies of ERPOs being used to prevent political violence in states like Washington, where ERPOs have been used to disarm neo-Nazis, mitigate threats made against the state's governor, as well as members of Congress who represent the state. Fifth, we recommend the repeal or the creation of exceptions for firearm preemption laws to give local governments the ability to create policies to address the risks of insurrectionism and armed political violence in their jurisdictions. And in many states, local efforts to respond to threats posed by insurrectionism and other acts of armed violence are stifled by what are known as preemption laws, which are policies enacted by state legislatures to prevent local governments from adopting policies that are more robust and stronger than the relevant state law. And they've been used to address a whole host of different categories of laws, ranging from expanding paid sick leave to anti-discrimination. But in many states, we've seen them impact specifically the ability for local governments to implement firearm policy restrictions. Colorado recently broke the mold in 2021 by repealing their state firearm preemption law to empower their local governments to take steps to address the needs of their local governments and constituencies. And we recommend that other states follow suit to address these issues. Lastly, and this recommendation isn't rooted in policy itself, but one that's ultimately relevant to our conversation, is the value of breaking the insurrectionist permission structure by openly denouncing violence. And we've seen in research conducted by Lily Mason and her colleague Nathan Hemlow that public figures are particularly well positioned to help quell risks of violence to an extent, because just like public figures can encourage people to support violence by endorsing it themselves, as we've seen show itself in the data, research suggests that they also have the potential to decrease violent attitudes of their supporters by openly denouncing violence. So though gun policies and other laws are an essential element to reducing the risk of political violence and intimidation, political leaders, by speaking out against violence, can have their own disarming effect. And Lily's in a great position to speak more on that, given that it's her own work. But with that being said, those are some of the solutions we advance to address this multifaceted problem, with the acknowledgement that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of angles to approach it from. This is just one way we believe that we can mitigate these critical threats to political institutions and the people who serve them in our country. Thank you. And pass back to Lily.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I can elaborate just a little bit on the role of leadership here. In a recent book called Radical American Partisanship with Nathan Calmo, we just tested what would be the effect of having regular people in America, read messages from either Joe Biden or Donald Trump that basically said violence is never acceptable. They were real quotes that they had actually said at some point. And what we actually found was that even just reading a short little thing from one of those two leaders reduced people's approval of political violence immediately. So what we've seen is actually that our leaders are very influential. They have a powerful role to play in reducing approval of violence in the electorate as a whole, which is important because if regular people in the electorate approve of violence, then the kind of more volatile people who might actually engage in violence are being are surrounded by people who are less likely to enforce the social norms against political violence. But our leaders do play a huge role. It's important when we hear pro-violence messages that those are countered by anti-violence messages, by not even necessarily elected leaders, but also media figures, people who are influential within the party that is issuing that type of pro-violence message. And it's relatively easy to discourage people from approving of violence. We just have to have responsible leadership to do that. So on that note, I want to start getting into these. We've got a lot of good questions coming in the Q&A. Please continue submitting them if you have anything that you're curious about. I'm noticing a couple of questions that fall into like clarifying category. So I think we should deal with those first, just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page and understanding the data in the same way. So I'm going to start with Jen, and I'm going to combine two questions from the audience. One is, what exactly does violence directed at the electoral process mean? They're curious whether it means violence directed at poll workers or election officials, and sort of how the respondents are thinking about that. And in addition, this is a question about the overall number being higher than all the other numbers. So just clarifying that number is not an average of all the other numbers, and clarifying what that number is.
Sure. So I'll start where you left off, clarifying the overall number there, Lily. As you said, it's not an average of the other pillars. The VDIT survey has a separate question asking respondents to provide their overall assessment of the impact that political violence is having on U.S. democracy. So that's a separate data point, not an average of the others. When it comes to the question of what violence directed at the electoral process means, this is a broad category that captures a number of different responses. Again, that's an open-ended question that respondents can answer in many different ways. But just to give you a flavor of the types of responses that we saw, the examples given in the question, the answer is yes to all of those. There's a range of concerns that experts expressed related to the electoral process. So some was concerns about the threats that have been reported on that are being leveled at election workers. There were a number of concerns expressed about violence that might follow, sort of questioning the legitimacy of electoral results. So it really does run the gamut from the types of threats that we see on an ongoing basis, not just on election day, to other concerns that experts expressed kind of throughout the process from the campaign period to election day, all the way through to ensuring a peaceful transition or maintenance of power.
Great, thank you, Jen. For Rudabeh, I have a couple of questions on the threats, the threat analyses themselves. One is whether you looked at the impact based on race and gender combined, so that we can see if there's a different impact for women of color. And also wondering whether you broke down the types of messages into, what type of insult, for example, is it hate speech versus a different kind of insult? And then finally, I'm going to ask you, I want you to answer this one too, which is, do you know if any of the local officials have indeed stepped down from their positions? So just a couple clarifying points, and then what is the result that you're seeing among elected officials?
Sure. So starting with your last question, answer is unfortunately yes. We have as part of the interview work where we've spoken with elected officials. We have indeed had some that have already stepped down since we spoke with them. Some that were pondering stepping down, and they equated why they were thinking of stepping down specifically to the threats and harassment they were receiving. And I know that someone else had asked too around a targeting of their staff, and just some of these people don't have staff. They're like local officials, right? They have very small teams. The ones that do have staff have indeed seen some of those their teams being targeted as well. But just to say that this is part of the problem is that these officials don't have very many resources that are available to them necessarily. So we've definitely seen the targeting working, so to speak. In terms of the question around women of color, what we did look at that. They, of course, women of color are still affected by higher rates across both of those threats, harassment, etc. But we've seen a particularly even worse effect when it comes to insults. So, but something to kind of keep in mind is that there's unfortunately a very small pool to be looking at when we're looking at women of color. People of color, women already make up small samples. So looking at specifically that subsample is a bit more narrow. In terms of the question around the type of targeting, that actually is a variable that we're picking up within the THD, the data set. We look at what type of targeting, if any, like what kind of hateful language or symbolism, whether there was racist language, sexist, anti-LGBT, anti-religious. We do try to pick that up to the extent that it's reported, right? Sometimes in reporting, there might not be all of the details, but in cases where we do have explicitly the language that was used against them, we pick that up in addition to what may have been the issue at stake. Of course, some threats and harassment are just I hate you. They don't really have something in particular that they're targeting. But sometimes there is a grievance, if you will. And in the cases where that exists, we are picking that up within the threats and harassment data set. So all of that data, codebook, the map, for example, someone had asked about the slides, all of that will be available next month.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, we had a few questions asking to read the report. So we have a lot of enthusiasm already in this audience. For Tim, a couple of clarifying questions. One of our audience members wants to know how Bruin affects laws prohibiting firearms in legislative buildings and polling places. And in addition to that, how can people learn more about ERPOs? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly, thanks for the questions. So in terms of your first question regarding the impact of New York Rifle and Pistol Association, or NYSERPA v. Bruin, the Supreme Court's 2022 hearing on Second Amendment law, and how that impacts some of the recommendations in this report, particularly to legislative buildings and polling places and other locations of political participation. We see encouraging rhetoric used by the court in their opinion. Now, the court did make an unprecedented change, the interpretation of Second Amendment law that really forced courts across the country to re-review essentially everything to ensure that the laws that they've upheld in the past under reasons of public health and public safety can also now be justified under this more scrutinous history analytical process that the court has greatly emphasized in their recent ruling. But fortunately, the court has said that there are some laws that are more presumptively lawful, or laws that there's a greater credence or likelihood that they be found constitutional, even independent of a scrutinous historical analysis. And specifically, the court listed amongst those potential presumptively lawful regulations the notion of sensitive places, the idea that there are some locations that are just so critical to the functioning of society or have members within them that are at such unique risk to violence that there ought to be greater protections around those spaces. And the court specifically listed government buildings, schools, but also in their more recent opinion, legislatures, courts, and polling places as specific areas where firearms could be constitutionally limited to help protect these other core functions of our country, which even though the courts have not had to rule on those specific issues yet, there's been a host of litigation about what constitutes a sensitive place, with some states being very exploratory and trying out a whole host of different venues. Amongst those include legislative buildings and polling places, but so far we've yet to see courts finding legislative buildings and polling places specifically to have problems or to rebut the Constitution in any way. So we find that very promising. In terms of learning more about extreme risk protection order laws, so currently the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health has a Bloomberg American Health Initiative website that focuses on a lot of core issues of public health, and one of them focuses on extreme risk protection orders. So there is, it's referred to as BAHI, abbreviated, has a IRPA website that specifically is created to provide as a resource for these laws. However, recently, Johns Hopkins has gotten a grant from the Department of Justice for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to help provide teaching and technical assistance to states trying to implement extreme risk protection orders in their jurisdictions. And so this IRPO resource center that the center has been operating through the leadership of some of my colleagues is in the process of creating a much more modern, much more up-to-date, contemporaneous website that have a host of resources that we hope to see online at some point this year.
Great. I'm going to add one more quick clarification. Someone wants to know how they can find out if their state has a preemption law.
Yeah, so most states unfortunately do at this present time, roughly 40 some, and most states do have their code available online for free. So even if you're not a lawyer with a Westlaw or LexisNexis account, you can still check your state statute to see if they have one of these laws. And that's something where I would also be happy to help provide extra clarification on off the call if you have follow-up questions.
Great, thank you. I want to move to a slightly broader question that I'd like any of you to respond to if you have thoughts on it, which is, how does the problem of political violence connect to other challenges that are facing our democracy, other things that are currently threats to democracy? How does political violence connect to that or fit in with those? Jen, do you want to go first?
Sure. So when we think about threats to democracy, there are really sort of 7 tactics that we can think of as constituting, what we at Protect Democracy and others might call the authoritarian playbook. And stoking violence is one of those 7 tactics, but one of the things that we've seen around the world, really, not just here in the United States, but when would-be authoritarians come to power or as democracy erodes, these 7 tactics operate piecemeal, and they interact with one another to sort of reinforce and build on one another. So if you look at things like spreading disinformation, right, which is another one of the tactics, or corrupting elections or aggrandizing executive power, these are all tactics within this playbook. We can really see how political violence kind of reinforces all of these types of moves. As sort of a piece of a political strategy, not to say that there's some sort of grand chess master moving the pieces around. Sometimes these things can even be kind of bumbling, right? But the cumulative effect of all of these different types of erosions of democracy are both fueled by, but also open up more space for political violence. So those are the ways in which other things that we might be concerned about besides violence can kind of create this broader ecosystem in which democracy can erode over time, drip by drip, sometimes in ways that are very, very visible, right? As we look at, January 6th as being the most prominent example, but sometimes that are less visible, that happen sort of out of public view, in some of the ways that we've even talked about the data here reflecting as well.
Thank you. Rudabeh or Tim, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I was just going to speak to the role that political violence really plays in having a chilling effect within like engagement within democratic processes. I mean, some of the work around our surveys, for example, in addition to asking, whether or not officials have experienced hostility, like threats, insults, etc., we're also asking them about their worries around these things. And some of that can really point to the chilling effect that even perceived threats of violence can have. And I think this can extend beyond officials alone, right? It can extend to those who want to engage in democratic processes. We'll be releasing in the next week or so a report on Dropbox monitoring, for example, around people feeling like they can't cast their votes because of the challenges that they might perceive, or the concerns they might perceive around like the violence that they may face. And so I think it has an impact in how people can be a part of this democratic process more largely, whether if it's actual manifestations of political violence, which can ebb and flow. They aren't fortunately terribly common, as Jen mentioned earlier in her presentation, but even the kind of perceived threat of them occurring can have somewhat similar impacts, I think. So I would just add that too.
And to follow up off of Rudabe's notion of chilling effects, we've also seen, as Rudabe mentioned earlier in feedback to one of her other questions, how violence, or even the perceived threats of violence or likelihood of violence, is enough to deter people from engaging in the democratic process at all, especially those that help it function, looking at election workers and elected officials. From survey data from the past few years, some states have had as high about 20 to 30% turnover rate of their local election officials, and several have left their roles as well, largely out of a concern that they're at risk or those near them are at risk. We've also seen reports and instances of when these election workers are pushed out based off concerns for their own safety or safety of those they care about. Some other people who are more invested in the ideation of election denialism and are looking for other ways to try to undermine democratic processes are attempting to occupy some of those roles that are recently vacated. And so it helps present an issue not just to the present functioning of how democracy will actualize itself, but also future functioning in terms of who will be monitoring these situations later down the road. In the 2020 election, there was over 60 lawsuits across the country about the presidential election, about to help determine who won what in which states by how much. But with people in critical roles who stood up in those instances to help uphold the will of the American people are no longer there, presents questions about what could happen if similar scenarios occurred in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. We do have an interesting question here that I think maybe all three of you might be able to answer, maybe with a little bit of speculation. But one of our audience members wants to know, what can I do to help combat political or anti-democratic threats or violence? It's Rudabe, do you have an, or Jen's ready?
Oh, I was going to say, if we're going around, I guess it comes back around to me.
Sure.
So I think that there are a number of things that sort of anyone, regardless of, their profession or their position, can do. I think it starts sort of foundationally, Lily, with what you noted, which is that a lot of this has to do with upholding norms. Okay, and I think your work really illustrates this importantly, and that's something that is a collective endeavor. That is something all of us can do in our own personal lives to kind of hold that bulwark of, the norm that violent rhetoric, that threats are not acceptable, right? Both in our own personal behavior and in sort of the politics that we all participate in. So I think that's one of the first things that we can all do to sort of uphold that that feature of our system. The second thing is that, regardless of where one finds themselves, your profession or the work that you do, there are ways to sort of integrate healthy democratic norms into the work that you do and to sort of participate in that, right? So if you are a faith leader or part of a faith community, for example, there are many things that you can do to help to address polarization within your own community, for example. One of the things that has come up repeatedly in recent waves of the VEDIT survey is experts' concerns about things like the breakdown of social norms, about things like polarization. And there are ways that anyone can address that within their own work, within their own community. So faith leaders can do that within their communities. Teachers can teach civics in the classroom, right? There are any number of different ways that within your own sphere, you can help to uphold those norms and to really foster a greater sense of civic engagement, civic community in healthy ways that support our democracy, that really bulwark against some of those forms of erosion that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I will just add here that from a political psychology perspective, norms are not laws. They're different things and they serve different purposes. And laws are enforced by law enforcement, but norms are enforced by all of us. And allowing them to be broken and not saying anything is one way that norms just disappear and fall apart. Thank you. Tim or Rudabeh, ideas on things people can do?
Sure. Just to add, I agree with everything Jen was sharing. I just wanted to plug, I'll drop a link in a moment, that we have a number of de-escalation resources that we can share by VDI. We have a state-by-state directory that has information on organizations that provide de-escalation resources for bystanders. It can be used by individuals, communities, but also election officials, poll workers, et cetera, where there might be a heightened risk of political violence. This is around types of conflict resolution trainings that can be offered to help people, in a much more tangible way, in addition to kind of larger conversations we need to be having around norms and not normalizing this type of violence. This could be the flip side would be very concrete suggestions around trainings and things. So I'll be happy to share that resource.
And I'll chime in on what's already been a great, well-rounded discussion on how folks can practically engage in their own lives to try and address these issues. And to go back to Lily's distinction of norms and laws, yes, we can all change norms. It's much more it's just in our own personal interactions, how we compose ourselves. There's just a wealth of opportunity. There's also more opportunity than people think to change and influence laws as well. As someone who works in this space, something that I was initially struck by is just how much legislators and policymakers, especially in the state and local level, listen to constituents. Doesn't matter in some cases how much research I have, how many experts I have to come with me. If there's an impassioned, affected constituent that comes with them with needs and a desire to have this policy, that can turn someone from a skeptic into a champion for that very issue. And people tend to overemphasize the value of Congress. It's important. Federalism, we have it for a reason. However, when we look at what most directly impacts our day-to-day lives, what do we have the most control over changing? It's really in state and local government. And so I highly recommend folks look up who is their House person, who is their state senator, how robust is their local government, especially if they live in a city, but it can apply to counties as well and smaller jurisdictions. And then see if they have laws such as the ones we're recommending or others that address these issues on the books that we know can help mitigate some of these risks of violence. And if not, find someone who you can help tell to that you would like to see it happen. And sometimes all it takes is a conversation that can lead to the passing of a law. And so I highly encourage people to think that even though it may seem big, it may seem complicated, it's really much more accessible than many may believe.
That's fantastic. I think for our last question, I want to ask Rudabeh in particular. We're talking about enforcing norms. We're talking about these threats sort of floating around out there. But what do we know about the perpetrators of those threats, right? As regular citizens, who should we be being sort of paying attention to and making sure to enforce norms around? Where are these threats coming from?
Thanks, Lily. So far in the data, we've been seeing that the vast majority of these threats are not coming from organized groups, if you will. They're not those that we might see engaging in more of the offline political violence, for example. And it's much more around ungrouped individuals, like quote unquote everyday people. And I think it really points to some of the discussions we've been having around the normalization of this type of violence, the normalization around using threats and harassment against officials to get one's way, especially in cases where those people might be seeing that threats and harassment are working in dissuading officials from continuing to seek reelection, for example, or remaining in office. So we've been seeing a lot of these otherwise ungrouped individuals. It also points to concerns around like impunity, I think, around these threats and harassments, right? And I think in a lot of cases, who the perpetrators are remain anonymous. In cases where we do know who they are, sometimes they, aren't necessarily affiliated with certain organized movements. So I think it just goes to show how pervasive I think this problem can be.
Yeah, and all the more reason for us to try to encourage better behavior among our fellow Americans and fellow citizens wherever we are. So we are basically out of time. I hope that this webinar was helpful for our audience members. I think it was even helpful for us just talking through some of these things and hearing about each other's work. I'm gonna first of all thank Jen, Tim, Rutabe. I want that you were all extremely informative and helpful. And I think there's a lot more information out in the world now that because you all gave us your thoughts. I want to encourage people, if you have any more questions that you'd like to have answered, you can send them to the Center for Gun Violence Solutions email address, which is CGVS, Center for Gun Violence Solutions, cgvs@jh.edu. And they're happy to engage with you and continue the conversation as time goes forward, as this election year goes forward, as we are likely to see multiple surprising events throughout before November. And so it's always good to have these ideas in your mind and thoughts about what's happening out there and also how we can make it better. So with that, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you all for being here. And thanks again to our panelists.